British officers mocked armored cars until they rolled across Palestine. The morning light rolled gently over fields of dew, glinting off polished harnesses and rows of proud horses standing motionless beneath their riders. The British cavalry was not merely an arm of war, it was a living symbol of empire, of elegance wrapped in iron discipline. Generals rode through camps as if parading through centuries of tradition. Every movement, every salute was steeped in a code of honor that had survived countless wars. The hoofbeats echoed with certainty, the same rhythm that had carried the empire across continents. There was no room for doubt. Horses had carried victory since Agincourt, since Waterloo. To question their supremacy was to challenge the soul of British command itself. The cavalrymen believed the horse's instinct was divine, that no machine could replace loyalty bred from flesh and will. Horses felt fear, smelled danger, sensed terrain. How could steel ever do that? Officers spoke of cavalry charges as poetry, of banners in the wind, and the thrill of breaking enemy lines. War was art to them, not mechanics. Yet beneath the romance lingered a blindness, one that mistook tradition for truth. When engines began to hum in the distance, few paid attention. To them, it was the background noise of modernity, irrelevant, passing, unworthy of the battlefield. But the world was changing, quietly, in the sheds of engineers and dreamers. The cavalry did not hear it yet, the low, metallic heartbeat of a new age waiting to arrive. In the officers' mess, the air smelled of pipe smoke and polished leather. Laughter rolled like thunder as young engineers presented sketches of motorized war wagons. The older officers smirked behind their glasses. "Tin coffins," one called them, "good for scaring birds, not Germans." The idea of replacing a regiment of riders with clanking, oil-soaked machines was met with almost theatrical ridicule. War, they believed, was a gentleman's pursuit, not a parade of engines and grease. To suggest otherwise bordered on heresy. They raised their cups to the absurdity of it all, confident that glory would forever belong to the mounted charge. But the laughter hid something else, fear of irrelevance. The empire had been built on movement and mastery of terrain, on men who could command beasts with the same grace they commanded nations. The notion that an engine might outpace courage threatened their very identity. So they mocked louder, convincing themselves that machines could never endure mud, heat, or chaos. Yet across Europe, the ground was beginning to shift. The Great War would not be fought on grassy fields under fluttering banners, but in mud, smoke, and steel. The cavalry's age was ending, though no one in that room could feel it yet. The laughter would echo long after it should have stopped to sound, soon to be swallowed by the roar of engines and the sandstorms of Palestine. In a quiet workshop in Derby, far from the parade grounds and the laughter of officers, a handful of engineers leaned over sheets of paper smudged with oil and graphite. They were not soldiers, at least not in the traditional sense. Their battlefield was a table of blueprints, their weapons imagination and stubborn faith. Among them stood men from Rolls-Royce and the Royal Naval Air Service, dreamers who saw not a toy but a new kind of night, one made of steel, powered by gasoline and unafraid of bullets. The early designs were ungainly, more carriage than weapon, with riveted plates and narrow slits for vision. But to these inventors, they were something more profound, a promise that courage could take shape and metal. When the first prototypes coughed to life, the sound was rough, like a wounded animal learning to breathe. Yet within that clatter was music, a strange symphony of the future. They tested in open fields, watched mud fling from the wheels, and smiled as sunlight caught the armor's dull gleam. Passers-by stopped and stared, unsure whether to laugh or applaud. Even within the army, whispers spread. They're serious about those things. But the inventors ignored the noise. They saw what others couldn't, that war was becoming faster, wider, more unpredictable. In this age of trenches and telegraphs, it would be the machine, not the horse, that carried the future forward. The first trials at the front were brutal. Engines sputtered, wheels sank deep into ruts, and armor cracked under rifle fire. Dust choked the radiators, and sand jammed the gears until the whole machine groaned like a dying giant. Soldiers gathered to watch and jeer as the great motor monsters struggled up slopes that horses climbed with ease. "A fine circus act," one officer muttered. But failure for the engineers was merely another set of instructions. Every jammed gear told them something. Every broken bolt revealed a weakness to fix. Nights were spent under lamplight, sleeves rolled, hands blackened with oil and frustration. They welded thicker plates, reinforced axles, replaced wooden wheels with steel. The smell of fuel mixed with the metallic tang of sweat and hope. These were not just machines, they were acts of defiance. By dawn, another prototype would crawl across the field, slower but stronger. It wasn't graceful, but it moved, and that movement was everything. When the brass demanded proof, the inventors offered not promises but persistence. "Give us sand," one of them said, "not mud." They knew the future would not belong to Europe's trenches but to open spaces where speed meant survival. Their creations waited, patient and awkward, for the right war to find them. And when it came in the burning deserts of Palestine, they would roll not just as weapons, but as symbols of a truth long denied. That even in war, progress begins with those willing to be laughed at. The war had dragged across Europe like a storm that refused to pass. Trench lines stretched endlessly, carved into the earth like open wounds. But beyond the mud and wire of the Western Front, another theater was awakening, one painted in gold and dust instead of gray. The British command turned its eyes eastward, toward the vast deserts of Palestine, where the Ottoman Empire still held its crumbling ground. There, the old rules of war dissolved beneath the sun. The horizon offered no trenches to hide behind, no forests for cover, only heat and endless distance. It was a battlefield made for speed and deception and perhaps for something new. When word reached the armored car divisions, there was skepticism mixed with opportunity. The same machines mocked in Europe were now summoned for a task no horse could endure. Officers doubted they would last a day. "Engines will choke before noon," they said. "Steel will melt before sunset." Yet others, quieter and wiser, sensed a strange justice in the idea. The very machines laughed out of the parade grounds would face their trial in the harshest place on earth. The journey began with rumbling convoys moving south, trucks, mechanics, and the awkward armored cars lashed to transport wagons. At Suez, the air shimmered like glass. The soldiers wiped sand from their faces and watched as the engines were lowered to the desert floor. They looked alien there, modern beasts among the ancient dunes. The camels turned their heads to stare, unimpressed. But the men who drove these vehicles felt something shift. Gone was the laughter of the old officers. In its place came curiosity and the smallest spark of belief. As the engine started, the air filled with a deep, metallic growl that carried for miles. It was not the gallop of horses, but it had its own rhythm, one that spoke of momentum, of a world changing gears. The first patrols were unlike anything the British Army had known. The armored cars moved in formation across sand seas that shimmered with mirage. Every mile tested their endurance. The heat boiled fuel, the wind bit through armor seams, and the fine dust crept into everything. Drivers wrapped scarves around their mouths, mechanics rode with spanners ready, fixing breakdowns on the move. But where cavalry would have faltered, these machines kept going. They crossed terrain that once divided empires, linking supply routes faster than couriers could dream. By night, when the engines cooled and silence fell, the soldiers gathered beside their metal companions. The desert sky blazed with stars, and the hulks of the vehicles gleamed faintly in the moonlight like sleeping beasts. In those moments, men who once mocked them began to speak differently, calling them partners, not contraptions. The desert had stripped away the noise of arrogance and left only what worked. Horses were noble, yes, but machines endured. Then came the first test of battle. Ottoman outposts spotted the British columns advancing and opened fire from ridges that seemed to melt into the sky. Bullets sparked harmlessly against the armored plates, singing metallic notes in the heat. The drivers gritted their teeth, pushed forward, and returned fire with the mounted guns. Sand exploded around them, and engines roared like living things. What had begun as an experiment now moved with purpose, each car a mobile fortress cutting through disbelief. As the sun set over the dunes, the men climbed from their machines, faces blackened with dust, and realized what had happened. The cavalry had not ridden that day, yet the empire had advanced. The age of horses was behind them, and the road ahead belonged to wheels and courage forged in steel. The Battle of Gaza began under a punishing sun. Waves of heat shimmered over the horizon, distorting everything: soldiers, mirages, even time itself. The British lines stretched thin, their supply convoys crawling through endless dunes. For years, war had meant trenches, mud, and static defense. But here, the desert was alive, shifting, consuming, and unpredictable. When the first Ottoman artillery shells fell, the sand leapt like water, spraying into the wind. Communication broke down almost immediately. Horses floundered in the dunes, their strength wilting under the merciless heat. Yet somewhere behind the chaos, engines rumbled to life, slow, steady, and unrelenting. The armored cars rolled forward like steel ghosts, their tires sinking then clawing free. They were not fast, not graceful, but they moved when nothing else could. The first assault took everyone by surprise. From behind a ridge, the cars emerged in a formation that shimmered in the heat, gun turrets swiveling, engines growling against the roar of battle. Soldiers cheered as bullets pinged harmlessly off the armored hulls, each spark a small miracle. The cars returned fire, cutting through enemy positions with deadly precision. To the men on foot, it felt as though something ancient, the desert itself, had turned in their favor. Officers who once dismissed the machines now watched them in stunned silence. "They move like ships on land," one whispered, as if afraid to disturb the spell. The machines maneuvered across the battlefield, carrying supplies, rescuing the wounded, and striking targets that cavalry could never reach. Dust clouds marked their path, long, curling trails across the desert that looked almost poetic from above. Each mile conquered was a quiet argument against tradition, a testament that innovation was no longer optional, it was survival. By the second assault, the armored cars had become indispensable. Their cruise mechanics, drivers, gunners had learned to move as one, communicating through gestures and instinct. Inside the cramped steel shells, the air was unbearable, reeking of oil, sweat, and cordite. But the men inside spoke with pride. "We were mocked once," one gunner said. "Now they follow our tracks." Every sound, every clank of gears, every echoing shot reminded them that they had built something greater than a weapon. They had built trust between man and machine. When the Battle of Gaza turned toward victory, it wasn't because of brute force, it was because of adaptability. The armored cars, once sidelined, had reshaped the rhythm of desert warfare. They struck fast, disappeared into dunes, and reappeared behind enemy lines. Scouts used them as mobile outposts, medics as rescue wagons, commanders as shields. The desert, which once favored the light-footed horse, now bowed to the rolling engine. But the cost of progress was felt even in triumph. As the guns fell silent, the battlefield glowed under the twilight-broken wheels, cracked armor, and men sleeping beside their machines. The horses stood tethered nearby, their flanks rising slowly in exhaustion, watching the silent beasts of steel that had stolen their thunder. The officers walked among them, hands clasped behind their backs, saying little. The arrogance that once filled their laughter was gone, replaced by quiet awe. In the fading light, the cars seemed to hum even at rest, cooling metal ticking softly as if breathing. To the men who had driven them, it felt like the earth itself was whispering a new truth, that courage need not wear a uniform, nor gallop on four legs. Sometimes it came in iron form, painted in dust and determination. And as night swallowed the horizon, the desert kept its secret that this was not just a victory of empire, but of evolution. The machines had proven not only their worth, but their soul. The telegram reached London before dawn. A short report, written in measured words, carried a quiet revolution within it. Armored car units effective in desert operations. recommend expansion. For the generals reading it, coffee cups half raised, the message landed like a confession. The machines they once called metal toys had saved regiments, shattered Ottoman lines, and carved through landscapes where cavalry had faltered. Yet, there was no fanfare, no victory parade for inventors or mechanics. Only silence. The old guards sat in their offices, portraits of past battles hanging above their heads, realizing that something irreversible had begun. For decades, the British Army's doctrine had been written by horsemen, men who believed courage was measured by how close you rode to danger. They saw the machine as cold, soulless, and unworthy of tradition. But the desert had told a different story. It was not the gallant charge that carried the day, but endurance, adaptability, and steel. As reports from Palestine spread, the tone in the war rooms began to shift. Senior officers spoke less and listened more. A few defended the old ways, but their words sounded like echoes of a past no one could return to. One colonel, once famous for mocking the engineers, requested to see one of the armored cars himself. It was brought to the parade ground, dented and dust-covered from Gaza. The crew stood beside it, exhausted, proud. The colonel walked around the machine slowly, tracing a finger across a bullet scar on the side panel. "It's ugly," he said quietly. Then, after a long pause, "But it works." That was the moment the laughter finally stopped. In London's workshops, the same men who had been ignored now found themselves summoned by the War Office. They were no longer hobbyists, they were architects of modern warfare. Rolls-Royce engineers presented new models with improved armor, stronger suspensions, and faster engines. The very word mechanized began to ripple through strategy meetings once dominated by maps and cavalry routes. The future had a sound now, a low, rumbling one, and it was impossible to unhear. But progress was never easy. Many officers resisted, arguing that technology could never replace human valor. "Machines cannot feel honor," one declared during a heated discussion. Yet the truth was more complex. The men who had driven those cars in the desert had felt honor not in defiance of tradition, but in evolution of it. They risked death in metal boxes with little visibility, little comfort, and no glory, all to prove an idea. Back at the desert front, word spread that command in London was changing its tune. The crews gathered under the night sky, laughter soft and disbelief still lingering. "They finally believe us," one said. Another replied, "No, they finally heard us." The engines hummed quietly beside them, as if sharing in the moment. When the official order came expansion of armored divisions, there was no celebration, only a steady sense of vindication. The desert had humbled even the proudest institutions, forcing them to listen to the hum of machinery where once they heard only hoofbeats. The officers who once mocked now saluted the men who had dared to build. As one mechanic later wrote in his diary, "War did not change men. It simply revealed who could change with it." The age of command had ended, the age of understanding had begun. And though the halls of the War Office still smelled of old paper and pipe smoke, somewhere beneath the noise of debate, you could almost hear it, the faint, persistent rumble of engines waiting for their next war. Years after the desert battles had faded into history books, a new kind of army began to take shape. The lessons learned under the sun of Palestine were no longer whispers among engineers, they had become doctrine. Armored cars evolved into tanks, trucks into convoys, and the world itself began to move on wheels. What started as ridicule had turned into revolution. Every design, every gear, every plate of steel carried the fingerprints of those early desert pioneers. The sound that once startled the horses of Gaza now echoed through Europe's factories, a mechanical heartbeat that would define the next century of warfare. But for those who had seen the first sparks of change, the memory was personal. They remembered the laughter of officers who doubted, the stares of soldiers who refused to believe that machines could survive the desert. And they remembered the moment the laughter died when the first armored car broke through enemy lines like a rolling miracle. In the years that followed, they told their stories to anyone who would listen. Tales not of glory, but of endurance. Of men who refused to stop turning their wrenches even when no one cared. In the new age of machines, the pioneers grew older, their hair grayed, their hands stiffened. Many retired quietly, forgotten by the same institutions they had changed. But every time a tank rolled down a city street, every time an engine growled on a distant front, their legacy lived on, carried by the rhythm of pistons and the hum of steel. Back in Palestine, the desert reclaimed what it could. The wind whispered through dunes where armored cars once thundered, and only fragments remained, twisted bits of metal half buried in sand, their edges softened by time. Locals would sometimes stumble upon them, not knowing what they were, and children would play on the rusting shells of what had once been the future. In those ruins lay both victory and humility, proof that even progress, no matter how unstoppable, eventually falls silent. Yet the spirit of innovation never truly dies. It lingers in those who dare to challenge what others call impossible. Every new generation of soldier, engineer, and dreamer inherits that same stubbornness, the same belief that intelligence and courage are not opposites, but allies. The armored cars of Palestine had not only changed the war, they had changed the definition of bravery itself. And for those who once drove them, memory carried a strange comfort. One veteran, interviewed in his final years, smiled when asked what he missed most. He didn't speak of medals or victories. He simply said, "The sound. That steady hum under my feet, it felt like the world moving forward." The age of horses had ended, but the age of courage never had. It had only changed form, from flesh to metal, from gallop to gear. And somewhere in the desert night, under the same stars that once watched the first engines roll, the wind still carried a faint echo, a reminder that progress often begins as a whisper, dismissed, mocked, and forgotten, until it roars loud enough to change everything. In that endless silence of sand and memory, the desert seemed to breathe once more, not for empire, not for conquest, but for the simple truth the armored cars had proven long ago, that the future always belongs to those who are brave enough to build it.